Dobrodošli v oddaji Otitis Media na frekvencah Radia Študent na 89,3 MHz. Ura je nekaj čez 11. Danes je prvi ponedeljek v mesecu oktobru. Poslušali pa bomo intervju z Antoinom Bousquetom, s katerim so se pogovarjala predvsem o vprašanjih sodobnega bojišča, sodobne vojne, dronov, mrež, distribuiranih mrež, decentralizacije, hierarhičnih struktur, vprašanja različnih kamuflažnih taktik in tako dalje. O vsem tem sem se torej pogovarjal z Antoinom Bousquetom iz Univerze Birkbeck iz Londona. Torej do naslednje oddaje Otitis Media, ki se bo pojavila zopet prvi ponedeljek v mesecu novembru, je to z moje strani vse.
It seems there came an end to old Westphalian Clausewitzian paradigm of war and warfare, which gave rise to the, as you call it, war without end, where securitization processes seem to be projected both to external as internal territories, where wars don't seem to end with treaties, and where human beings as casualties or soldiers seem more and more intertwined with technology. Yet, and I quote your article here, as our incorporation into this martial assemblages deepens further, it becomes ever more pressing to attend to the critical question of the endurance of a human autonomy, increasingly evanescent and otherwise perhaps destined to be someday no more than a faint ghostly presence in the war machine. End of quote. If the humans will become obsolete for the warfare, are human beings really needed to manage it? In other words, if there are theories that explicate the autonomy of capitalism, where humans as workforce will no longer be needed to obtain surplus value, is there a possibility of war being waged by itself and in itself?
Well, we get into the deep end here straight away with, this really evokes the question of the potential autonomization of the war machine and the role that technology can play within that. I mean, I think to approach that question, and in relation to the way you framed your question, I think it might be useful to think about what we conceive of as the motors of technological development, which is such a pervasive feature of our societies. There's a tendency, I think, classically, particularly on the left wing, to think of technological development as being driven by economic forces, and of course, it's particularly the dynamics of capitalism that we associate with the current technological acceleration. And although, of course, I think there's a lot to that analysis, what that's tended to do is to omit the considerable influence of military imperatives. Particularly, I think, in the 20th century. Because when we look at technological development in the military sphere, we don't see the obvious kinds of profit-seeking motives that we associate with capitalist ventures. There's a same search for efficiency and the improvement of certain processes, but profit is not the motivating force. It's the need to prevail over an enemy or an adversary. And when you see the way in which conventional Marxist analysis has dealt with that problem, well, it's generally seen war as a second-order effect of capitalism. So in other words, capitalism is the central phenomena, and war is just a direct side effect or second-order effect of capitalism. And you see that most clearly in the classic theories of imperialism, such as formulated by Lenin, where effectively imperialism and war, the First World War and so on, is effectively just a product of capitalism. And the assumption here being that if you change the economic system, then war disappears. And I think we see that kind of thinking continuing in more modern versions of contemporary thinking, notably in what's now referred to as left accelerationism, which takes, I think, certain traditional Marxist conceptions and updates them. And acceleration takes technology very seriously, takes the acceleration of technology seriously, as the name indicates, and it wants to repurpose and redirect those to non-capitalist ends, but it ends up saying very little about the military aspects of the question. And I think there's a couple of challenges we could offer to that. One is, well, what if the fundamental driver of technological acceleration doesn't lie with capitalism itself? What if a radical change of economic system, difficult as it might seem today, would nonetheless leave the underlying momentum of the technique unchanged? So one of the, I think, useful resources for thinking about this is the work of Paul Virilio, because Virilio reverses the Marxist perspective when he contends that logistics came out of war, and it's only subsequently that it migrated to civilian economic productions. In other words, logistics is, increasingly dominant, but it also a product of war, and that therefore war has preceded the implementation of such systems of allocation, as we can see in the wider economy. And Virilio goes further, of course, because he says to us that war is increasingly nothing but logistics, that war is inherently a logistical process today, and accordingly tends to empty politics out of its content. Now, I'm not advocating swapping one crude reductionism for another. I don't want to say that the entire history of technology has been determined by the conduct of war. I think that the Marxist analysis of the role of capitalism in technological development and acceleration is very important. But I do think we have to consider the possibility that continuous military acceleration since 1914, and I think that the 20th century is pivotal in this, and particularly the First World War, this acceleration may have a momentum of its own that we need to contend with. We may be living in a world today where technological development is not simply driven by economic motives, but also by the military, and that it's not necessarily satisfactory to just reduce military activity and the war to simply an addendum of capitalist incentives.
This brings me, in a way, to the question of the absolute origin, but I will connect this with the next question, which is that according to Clausewitz's later writings, the purpose is inherent to war itself, and this is also one of the theories we will talk about. So absolute war, as he sees it, is theoretically necessary but practically impossible. Guha, in his work on Clausewitz, claims that even if the absolute war is only an idea, it is at the same time an accurate concept in which reason confronts its own limits. Ernst Jünger, and you were also writing about Ernst Jünger in one of your articles, says that total mobilization, and I quote, his work is far less consummated than it consummates itself, end of quote, and that the total mobilization is merely an intimation of that higher mobilization that the age is discharging upon us. Characteristic of this later type of mobilization is an inner lawfulness to which human laws must correspond in order to be effective. End of quote. So Nick Land also talks about the cryptoteleology of war as a deep structure of war, which on the outside implicates violence, but on the inside it works as an evolution of intelligence, a neo-Darwinism of kinds. But on the other hand, Deleuze and Guattari complement their concept of nomadic war machine with Clausewitzian concept of the absolute war, which I mentioned before, where the state represents a total interiority and the nomad the total exteriority. So how can we read these different interpretations of war, which you already mentioned before in your first answer, which seem to be posited on the opposite limits of political spectrum?
Well, I think we have to see that war is a phenomena that strains both society and thought to its limits. War ruptures existing orders and it unsettles conceptual categories. That's why I think war is a kind of liminal concept that we really struggle to define in a very accurate way, because as soon as we approach it too closely, things tend to fall apart. And I think one of the great contributions of Claus is one of the reasons why he's endured is that he has grasped that very clearly in his thinking, and you evoke this notion of absolute war that Clausewitz develops. because Clausewitz starts off by trying to approach war from a purely logical perspective, rather. And he argues that logically speaking, war must tend to the absolute. That war sets into motion action and reaction, an escalation of means that signifies that war will naturally lead to an absolute, to an extreme, at which point one side will destroy the other completely. But Clausewitz's next move is to say, well, this logical, absolute conception of war cannot be realized. And when we look at what he calls real war that happens in the concrete, in the world that we know, in fact, we fall short of that. The reason being, he argues, which is that because it's impossible to wage war in a single instant, because it's impossible to make a single blow, to destroy the enemy in a single blow, whether it's impossible to escalate to the extreme in an instant, because war is made of a temporality that has its breaks and its pauses. Because of that, politics, policy, reason, all infused practice of war. In between actions, there's the opportunity for the different actors who are involved in the conflict to reconsider their situation, to assess the position in which they're in, and to make corresponding decisions, which may at some point lead to one side surrendering, deciding it's not worth to keep fighting, or even a side that's winning decide they've won enough, there's no need to keep pushing. What I think is interesting to consider is that this conception of Clausewitz, so just to reiterate the point I was earlier point, Clausewitz is, I think one of the very interesting things about Clausewitz is that he builds into his theory this idea that there's a distinction between the abstraction of war and the practice of it, and there's a kind of back and forth between it, which means that he posits certain limits as well on what we can know about war. But it's also, I think, worth considering and contemplating that some of the limits that Clausewitz thought he could see on war in his own time, of course he's writing in the early 19th century, might no longer quite avail today. Particularly, I think, when we think about the escalation that took place in the 20th century and what Junger calls total mobilization. This idea that society becomes brought in its totality under the sole imperative of war. We could start envisaging situations where the political becomes entirely subordinated to the military, and that might acquire a kind of momentum and dynamic of its own. Perhaps its most clear apogee is the prospect of nuclear war, because the kind of nuclear war that the Soviet Union and the United States were preparing for actually makes possible something that Clausewitz thought was impossible. Right? You could have a war that could be over in a matter of hours, that would escalate immediately to total annihilation, in which there would be no space for politics. Once the missiles are launched, there's no negotiation, there's no calling them back, there's not going to be an after in which the different parties may assess what they're going to do next. Now, what seems to have happened, of course, is that this very impossibility, or this very danger or threat of absolute war, has been warded off to some extent by itself, right? By the concept of the deterrence. So both sides have said, well, we are going to adopt a position where if you attack us, we will retaliate with such power that we will destroy you. So we haven't seen, thankfully, nuclear war. But perhaps something else has happened. Is that because one way is to say, well, maybe this ended the age of mobilization. Don't get total war anymore of the form we saw in the First and the Second World War, because total war, everyone seems to recognize, would mean mutual annihilation. But I think we might argue that war, in a sense, has dispersed into a much more diffuse condition because of it. It's not that we've demobilized. We may have demobilized in the sense that not entire countries are serving in their militaries, but we still live in societies that are always on the verge of a total war, because these weapons exist and they're primed to being launched. And it seems as if we are moved into a kind of different condition of war without end, in which we see continuous logistical exercises in global targeting, and relentless processes of secularization in domestic societies. In other words, rather than the vision of total war, which would have seen war as everywhere being conducted in a very brief moment, what we seem to be having is much more sporadic deployments of targeting around the globe increasingly, and a logic of security that permeates our societies ever more deeply, in the sense that everything comes to be seen through the lens of security, and of course particularly in this day and age through the threat of terrorism.
Here it seems that that the absolute war as a concept changed more, is being developed or is developing itself more in space than in time, as you were mentioning absolute war as the war that will immediately destroy the enemy, etc.
Yes, I think you could say that. Or you could think about the conventional absolute war, where wars fought for, at least on the face of it, grand ideological claims. Or the supremacy of a state in the in the kind of First World War, or in the name of communism or fascism or liberal democracy. There's going to be a showdown that's going to see one of these ideologies prevail. At least that was kind of the way in which we understood the stakes of this kind of war. But the kind of war we see today, and I even I would query whether the term of war is even appropriate anymore to understand these particular modalities of violence. But it isn't highly ideological, certainly at least not within the perspective of developed countries. It obeys much kind of narrower rationalities of security, of management, of risk. It isn't. The grand ideological vision isn't espoused. There isn't also the idea that there's a conflict that will settle everything. There's the horizon of an indefinite horizon of continuous risk and danger that has to be managed, addressed, and so on.
And I think that the concept of absolute war also brings us in these times to the concept of artificial intelligence, which seems to play in its particular forms a strong part in the contemporary warfare, be it machine learning or whatever. And your research on the eye as the function of the weapon seems to point in the direction of weapon similarity to the functions of the eye, but at the same time, it seems that your research is explicating the need of some algorithmic processes behind this biomorphic eye, which could no longer be human. If the best way to modulate the flight of the bombs in the last seconds in the Second World War was to use human intelligence, and I'm thinking here of kamikaze fighters, how did this change? Maybe after Second World War, and we will talk about contemporary warfare a bit later.
Well, I think when it comes to this question of artificial intelligence, I think I've approached it perhaps in a slightly different way than many others have, in the sense that I haven't really looked at the development of artificial intelligence from the perspective of the attempts to codify and replicate mental activities such as learning and problem solving. So that, the kind of things that we're talking about a lot today. When we think about AI, we tend to think about AI as a kind of substitute for human cognition, and with a lineage that goes back to a few decades, effectively. In a way, what I've been more interested in is thinking about the incremental abstraction of largely unconscious processes of perception, the way in which activities of human perception have been progressively abstracted and mechanized and automated. And that, of course, entails the development of algorithms, as a set of rules to be mechanically applied. In fact, of course, the condition of mechanization is precisely to formulate some kind of abstract model that can be instantiated in different materials. But these are only belatedly understood as algorithms, right? So I think some of the processes and some of the abstractions I'm looking at weren't understood as algorithms, but we can today see them as algorithms because that's become a dominant way in which we understand this abstraction of rules. Now, I think one of the important things that happened in the Second World War, and that is a hinge, if you want, between the more contemporary understanding of artificial intelligence and what came before, is the development of cybernetics. Because cybernetics emerged in the Second World War out of out of war efforts, out of research that was being done, notably on anti-aircraft defenses. And the key figure, of course, here is Norbert Wiener. And cybernetics achieved or formulated a kind of conceptual and methodological framework for understanding the behavior of systems, but crucially understanding them, whether they're biological or mechanical. If we look at the title of Wiener's masterwork, Cybernetics, the subtitle of it is Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, published in 1948. And what Wiener does is to unite control and communication through the concept of information. So cybernetics is, of course, not the only discipline that at this time is coming to this scientific conception of information, but I think cybernetics is an important hinge here. And what it does is reconceptualize systems, behaviors, actions through the concept of information and through the role of iterative feedback loops, the idea that there's information flowing within a system, between a system and its environment. And that, I think, was crucial in providing a conceptual and technical armature for deepening the integration of organism and machine. So it allowed us to start understanding what human bodies and machines do with the same kind of language, and de facto, of course, to understand better how they can be integrated and assimilated into one another's. And cybernetics, interestingly, as a discipline, has all but disappeared. There really isn't much contemporary cybernetics research, at least that calls itself cybernetics. But it's almost been a victim of its success. That is, this conceptual framework pervades our culture, not only within science and engineering, but much more widely, because we think so naturally today in terms of information, in terms of feedback, and increasingly in terms of a very porous boundary between the organic and the machinic.
If, as you say, the cybernetics permeated almost the whole society already, or at least one part of it, which is maybe the theoretical, the academia, and so if we are trying to think about cybernetics, I have a quote here by Jairus Groh. He writes that cybernetics is dangerous because it is true and it works. That's his quote, which permits the possible future in which we are no longer capable of regretting its truth. What does that really mean? I mean, I interpreted that as a future where humans will be no longer needed or even undesired. But this my interpretation might fall under this anthropocentric fallacy regarding artificial intelligence, which will supposedly kill us. So the artificial intelligence will be here to destroy the humankind. And Benjamin Bratton says that AI isn't going to be biomorphic, which implicates that AI won't or might not develop the same desires as human beings. So what might that mean for the future of warfare might be the second question, following the one on the interpretation of the role of cybernetics in the contemporary world.
Well, I mean, I have to say that I'm generally quite cautious about artificial intelligence, because I think there's a lot of very excitable talk out there at the moment about the supposed imminent development of what's referred to as general artificial intelligence, right? The idea of artificial intelligence as something that's going to exceed, to match and then eventually exceed human intelligence. And I mean, certainly that is a kind of anthropocentric conception of AI, because the model is the human, the idea that we're going to build machines that think like humans and even think better than us. But I mean, I do think much of this talk, interesting as it is to consider, is quite premature when you look at the real state of development of artificial intelligence. AI performs in certain areas very well, but these tend to be very specific and extremely circumscribed, which means that you really have to define the problem set for the AI to perform its task. Once you remove those boundaries, then it's very likely to flounder. And even when and that's, for example, illustrated, I think, in the military context when we look at the work's being done on computer vision, on machine vision. So we know that you can get programs can be trained quite well. Neural networks, notably, can be trained quite well to, say, recognize photographs on the internet, for example. But when you try to develop software to get an AI to recognize a tank, or even more with greater difficulty, a soldier in a open environment, then the challenges are considerable. It's not that these algorithms can't pick up certain things, but that they would get to but they are very far from being to the point where you would be comfortable to entrust them entirely with making those kinds of discriminations. In many areas, humans are still far superior at the performance of many tasks. So my view is that AI and algorithmic decision making is very important. It's definitely a growing issue for human societies. But I'm a little bit circumspect about the kind of apocalyptic languages being used when we talk about the advent of human replacing AI. Indeed, I think it's actually a problem for us when we start focusing on this too much, because I think what we are missing is that in the medium run, at any rate, what we're likely to see much more clearly is the continued convergence of humans and machines. And that, to me, is the true contribution of cybernetics, or the true legacy of cybernetics, over and above the constitution of future artificial intelligence. The reason why I think this is important is because I think that before we ever see anything like a general AI, it may well be that it will become very increasingly difficult to disentangle humans from machines. And I think this, to illustrate, I think this point, it's worth thinking about the debate that's arisen around what's called lethal autonomous weapon systems. Right? So this has got a certain amount of media coverage. There are concerns that the military is planning to deploy autonomous weapons, that's to say, weapons that would, on their own, independently identify a target and take the decision to destroy that target. And of course, there's been a fairly high-profile campaign called the Campaign to Ban Killer Robots, which has, tried very publicly to advocate for a ban of these types of machines. But the way in which the campaign does it is to insist, as it puts it, on maintaining meaningful human control. This is a term that's bandied around, meaningful human control, which all sounds great, but the problem is how you might actually ever define or operationalize this idea of meaningful human control. And when you look at the debates and when you try and work through the kind of conceptual issues and practical issues, you realize that concept is extremely difficult to define in any reliable way. And in fact, of course, because there's a whole raft of different ways in which humans can be embedded in these machines. It might be that what you mean by that is an individual has to actively control the system from throughout every stage of its operation, or it might mean that you simply want the individual to be on the loop, which is to mean that the individual doesn't necessarily perform any tasks but is constantly supervising it and can abort the process at any particular point. And in fact, of course, when you do look at what the military is saying, there's very little appetite within the military itself to develop fully autonomous systems that they can exert no control over, not least because systems over which there is no control, or at least no human embedded in at some point, will raise all sorts of complicated issues regards to the laws of war, which, who is responsible if something goes wrong, in other words, right? Is it going to be the manufacturer? Is it going to be the software programmer? Is it going to be the military institution that deployed it? Is it going to be and so on? So it's very likely that humans will stay embedded in these systems for quite a foreseeable time, if only to create a kind of chain of command. But the issue here, and it goes back to my original point, is what I think we will see much more likely, and what we already are seeing, is the progressive outsourcing of cognitive operations to machines that then shape the human elements, what the military calls the human elements situational awareness. That's to say that human decision making is being increasingly informed by the way machines process the environment, by the types of interpretations they make, by the recommendations that they might provide. So when we talk about killer robots, autonomous weapon systems that need to be banned, that's all fine, well and good. But what we are missing is that right now, and in the very close future, humans are being embedded in technical assemblages that are increasingly orienting their behaviors in such a way that agency becomes increasingly distributed, and that conventional notions of human autonomy are problematized. So I think there's a risk that by focusing on the long-term horizon of a fully autonomous weapon, what we are missing is the ways in which already today human agency is being dissolved or disaggregated within much wider socio-technical systems.
This might also be said of the drones, I guess, in a certain way. But I have a quote from one of your articles, which I guess is also explicating this divide, the non-existent divide between the human and technology, where you say that technologies are all too often treated as deus ex machina that seemingly appear from nowhere and induce major transformations in the conditions of war. End of quote. This seems to be connected to some other things, which I would like to talk to you about, and this is the symbol of the contemporary warfare seems to be the drone, as I mentioned, because, for example, in a theory of the drone, Gregory Chamayou analyzes the political, legal, and philosophical, technological implications arising from the dronization of warfare. And a central question that animates this study is whether killing without any risk of being killed qualifies as war, whereas the drone seems to represent the new stage of warfare as such. This seems to be also connected to the classical reference, the stirrup theory, which I guess the drone is the same example, because as you said, there are different types of these assemblages going on between human and technology, but the drone seems to be the one that got into the mainstream, most efficiently. So what are your thoughts maybe on this question of drone as a symbol of the contemporary warfare in regard to the things you were talking about before, human, technology, etc.?
I mean, you're quite right, of course, that there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of coverage about drones in the last few years, a lot of academic literature, and some of it has been very good, but the sheer volume of it, I think, invites the contention there's a certain amount of drone fetishism, right? That there's a focus on the drone as a special technology. So there can be a tendency to see the drone as, a unique technology, something that possesses particular causative powers, when really the drone is only the latest materialization of a nexus of technologies of perception, representation, geospatialization, and remote control, that have a long history, and I've attempted to trace that history in some of my work, and who can concatenate in different technologies, different versions of combinations of these technologies. And of course, even to talk about the drone as a unitary technology is problematic, because there are all sorts of different kinds of drones that can do different types of things. So it's not necessarily helpful to think of it as in a kind of monolithic category. So the drone, I think, can be a useful prism for understanding many of the defining processes and tendencies, trends within contemporary warfare. And I think that in that respect, the drone is emblematic. But I think that's good as so long as we don't make the drone into somehow a unique technology. It's crucial, I think, to understand that technical objects are deployed within socio-technical assemblages, that we can't abstract the technology out of all the different relations that sustain that technology and that dictate or inform the way in which it is deployed. And you raised the example, the classical example of the stirrup, which I discussed a little bit in one of my papers, and I think that is a useful way because to think about this, because the debate of the stirrup is very influenced by the writing of Lynn White, medieval historian, who tried to make a very grand claim that the stirrup was occasioned, so the stirrup being, what allows a soldier to sit on a horse and to charge something without being thrown from their saddle, that the stirrup made possible the knight in the medieval period, or the origins of the medieval period, and that the knight became the most effective fighting unit on the battlefield, and therefore the European societies became reorganized in order to produce these very expensive units, because training a knight is very expensive, because the armor of a knight is also costly to produce. And he ended up suggesting that the whole model of feudalism actually could be traced back to that single technology. And that's the kind of seductive argument that we are drawn to. And you see similar kinds of arguments being made about how the computer has transformed society or any other technology might have done. But I think that is a very problematic way of formulating it, because we do this by abstracting the technology from a much wider context. And with a stirrup, we can start falsifying in many ways White's claims by looking at the way in which the stirrup was adapted and employed in other social contexts. So in China, the stirrup also became widely adopted and produced mounted soldiers. But it didn't produce a kind of feudal organization, because there was a very powerful Chinese state that could produce fighting units without having to decentralize authority to local potentates. But we can also, in a more kind of even more different adaptation, we can look at the way in which the stirrup is adopted by nomads, the nomads of the steppe, who didn't use the stirrup as a means to create these charging knights, but rather as a stabilizer for archers, so that they could fire their arrows while they were riding their horses. And of course, we know the nomadic way of war was quite superior in many ways to the sedentary way of war for long periods in our history. So again, we only understand the stirrup when we put it in the wider context of a broader socio-technical organization. To kind of summarize everything that I'm getting at I think that we've tended in debates about the role of technology in society to oscillate between what's been referred to as technological determinist arguments, right? That say a technology comes about and it just in this kind of Deus ex machina model and transforms society, and that's generally being countered by people saying, well, no, actually technology is completely socially constructed. It's all about social ideologies or social pressures and social incentives, and actually I think that's not the answer. Well, that's not what I'm trying to articulate, because I think that in a sense it just exchange one vice for another, because when we do that, we start saying, well, technology is merely socially constructed, then we think of technology as something there's just a screen for the projection of social desires, of social needs. I think in fact the way through this is to view that this is a false problem that's created by not understanding our collectives as being inherently socio-technical. That's to say, by assuming that there's such a thing as society that's separate from technology, whereas in fact we live in societies that only exist because there's technology around us all the time, and this technology is always in use, always in being socially applied. It doesn't also arrive as if it fell from the sky. So I think once we start understanding our collectives, and I think that's the term to use, as being socio-technical, some of these problems of determinism versus social construction kind of fall apart, and we start being able to trace the interconnections, the relations that give rise to certain technologies, and then see them applied, but also reappropriated and redeployed in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about the wider context in which we should see technology. in one of your texts, you mention General John Abizaid and his take on networks, where he says, and I quote, "The enemy is in fact more networked, more decentralized, and operates within a broader commander's intent than any 20th century foe we have ever met. In fact, this enemy is better networked than we are," end of quote. So this comes, another quote is that it takes a network to beat a network, and our network must be better. This is a part of this kind of a wider context, a wider theory, I guess, explicated by many theoreticians, but also by Galloway and Thacker in their book The Exploit, where they talk about the need to network against network fight. They talk about the network against network fight as something that is already that something else should be done. That this was already done, because as Empire created the multitude as its better foe, the multitude as decentralized network, as they say, is the multitude is creating the exploit as its better foe. And the goal of resistance to this multitude is to find the exploits, just as hackers do, and use them to bring about change, but in this case change for the betterment of society. Galloway and Thacker lay out some principles for those who, undeterred by possible kinship with hackers and viruses, want to bring about changes in networked environments in similar fashion. So, like the networks themselves, moves towards resistance must be unhuman, resembling artifacts of nature such as swarms and floods. So here, I guess, the question is, if we have this networked, if we have decentralized networks more and more in the contemporary warfare, what might be these exploits that Thacker and Galloway are talking about?
Well, I think it's fair to say that network thinking does dominate military thought and practice today. And that's, of course, a much wider fact about our contemporary societies. As Manuel Castells put it, the network is the social morphology of our time. And in my work, I've tried to associate that with what I call the scientific regime of chaoplexity, associated with the idea of the sciences of chaos and complexity, which I think is important to see as both an extension of cybernetics, in the sense that it's still founded on a conception of information. It's still concerned with with feedback loops and with the distribution of information within systems that cut across various domains. But also, it's also in some ways an outgrowth of it and a development of it, because where cybernetics was very much focused on stability, on homeostasis, on the persistence of systems, the sciences of chaoplexity are very interested in dynamic self-emergence, adaptive systems, self-organization, and that's been the kind of so not so much how systems sustain themselves, although that can be part of it, but also how systems change, how they emerge, how they develop, how they come about in the first place. And in the military context, that's given rise to what we could call chaoplexic warfare, which really locates itself within that kind of set of scientific ideas and departs from many of the conventional assumptions about military organization. So the idea that centralization and central command is essential, that it has to be a clear hierarchy. The emphasis here is on decentralization, on distribution of information, and all of that, came to the fore in the 1990s in what's been known as network-centric warfare, and associated concepts of swarming. Again, based on the idea that you no longer line up forces in static concentrated formations, but that you distribute them across the battle space. And these ideas have had their peaks and troughs. The after the Iraq War, network-centric warfare fell out of fashion because it was perceived to have been to fail to at least to bear the brunt of the lack of success in Iraq. But these ideas are clearly still around, even if the terminology has changed. You asked a question about what the exploits are, and the exploits might be to identify, the vulnerabilities of such systems, which may be precisely the communication links, the protocols that allow these systems to communicate with one another. Although I think to a large extent the default assumption has been, for people who want to formulate movements of resistance since the 1990s, has been, well, we need to adopt the swarm, we need to adopt the network. This goes back to Abzade's point. If the enemy's a network, you need to be even more of a network. But I think what's come to realization in the last 10 years or so is that there's still a need for some measure of hierarchy, some measure of command, whether it's hierarchy understood in terms of command, in terms of responsibility, or in terms of long-term strategy. And for one, state militaries are inherently hierarchical. A state is the hierarchical entity. So even if a military wants to decentralize and wants to move towards a network, there's a limit to how far it can go without it becoming then a truly autonomous war machine, which is perhaps one of the possible outcomes. But insofar as it wants to remain a state military, it needs some kind of hierarchical dimension. But I think that's also been, this is a realization that's also come to the fore, I think, in resistance movements in the wider left, particularly in the aftermath of what's been, I think, largely understood as a failure of the anti-globalization and Occupy movements, which are movements that totally espouse this horizontal outlook, this idea of decentralization, of networking. We see that these are quite powerful ways of organizing, and they, allow for very adaptive, dynamic movements, but they, have been unable to convert the kind of energies that they've released into real programs for change. And I think, some of the work we've been seeing by people like Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, following from the Accelerationist Manifesto, is an attempt to argue for the necessity of strategy, of some amount of hierarchy, and perhaps the success in the UK today of the Corbyn and the Labour Party is an indication that, the path to power and to change for the left, it cannot be pure horizontalism, at least in the world in which we live today.
But it seems that kind of the radicalization of this decentralization can be seen in a way in the theories or the thinkings of different theoreticians. For example, Gitte Duplessis, in her article War Machines Par Excellence, talks about the biological weapon in a way, and the weaponization of infectious agents, where she points to the inherent limits of technological attempts to make nature into weapons for human ends. So this seems to be quite the opposite of the things you were saying, and can also be connected, I guess. I mean, because, for example, Nick Land, in one of his older texts, writes that, and I quote, "For the future of war, study bacteria," end of quote. This, on one side, seems to implicate that the weapon will not merely be a means to an end in the future, but that at the same time it will be, as you said, defined as an autonomous war machine without any human intentions being incorporated into this assemblages, for to say, or into this totally non-human war machines, be it viruses which go out of control, or etc. So, but I have this. Simondon, in his On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, he says on this connection, about which we are talking about in this interview quite a lot, between human and technology, he says that use of living matter as technology, as in the case of greenhouse flowers and fruits, inevitably ends up rendering living beings more artificial, that is, more abstract, but and this seems to be crucial, more dependent upon constant human intervention. and he buttresses this claim with the assertion that greenhouse flowers will eventually be unable to reproduce on their own. But as we see in today's world, this is not the case. I mean, he was writing this in the 50s and 60s, so I guess now the things are much more intertwined than they were before, but at the same time there still exist, I mean, some outer agents which are not usable in the warfare, for example bacteria, viruses, etc. So if we have on one side this retardation, meaning to slow down this decentralization of the network society, on the other hand we have some things that that radicalize this already quite decentralized, unhierarchical, etc. network. So what are your thoughts here? I mean, because some might also connect these differences to the difference between left accelerationism and the right accelerationism, which Nick Land, for example, adopted in the last few years.
Starting with this question of biology and perhaps in a more prosaic level with the weaponization of biology, I think it's possible to see that weaponization of biology as the next frontier for development. In many ways, we've seen actually quite limited use of bioweapons to date. We know that notably Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States have accumulated very large stocks of bioweapons, but they haven't been deployed very often. Largely, I think it can be said, because of the limited control that any party would have once they get released. There's a big risk of blowback. That once you release a pathogen in the atmosphere, it will indiscriminately kill. Now, this could perhaps change in the future with the development of infectious agents that target certain genomes. Right? So genetic research may in the future allow us to tailor pathogens so that they target only certain individuals. It might even be possible to program them to target only a particular individual that has a particular genome, or it might be larger groups. We could think of fairly dystopian scenarios where this may come to pass. But in any case, I think Duplessis is right to underline the inherent limits of human control over what might be the ultimate swarm, the innumerable, rapidly mutating, invisible bacteria. And this raises the question of whether that swarm organization, that degree of swarm organization, is something that could be reconciled with human concerns at all. I think that could be questionable. Our mechanical technologies so far are more predictable, than bacteria, because they're composed of inert matter and they tend to be entirely designed by us. Right? Our conventional machines are the ones that we've built up pretty much from scratch. But when we see current technological trends, it may be that future generations of technology will seem to us more organic and more bacteriological. Might think, for example, about the trend towards miniaturization and proliferation, the so-called small and the many. So increasingly, thinking about robotic swarms made of very small machines, perhaps even at the nanoscale, who may interact in very complex and unpredictable ways as they're connected within ever greater architectures of information feedback. We might see machines increasingly, or swarms of machines, that gain greater autonomy to determine their actions, maybe even have the possibilities of rewriting the rules that govern their behavior. And of course, we may see machines fusing increasingly with biology. We may increasingly make machines out of biological components or through the recoding of DNA and genomes. And I think within all that, clearly control and predictability may become a lot more problematic than it currently is. I think the swarm, and when we think about the swarm and about perhaps what's often seen as its polar opposite, the hierarchy, I think we have to understand that these are kind of absolute models, if you want, but in practice, in reality, we always see generally kind of mixed forms of them. This goes back, this I think very much echoes the discussion that Deleuze and Guattari have in the opening of 1,000 Plateaus, when they talk about the rhizome and the tree, which are really two different way, just different terminology to say the same thing. And they insist that, rhizomes are always constituting, trees are always growing out of rhizomes, and rhizomes are always sprouting out of trees. And I think once you start thinking about these forms as mixed, we avoid kind of overly binary kind of formulations. Let me just finish with perhaps a thought that came to mind with this evocation of Simondon's discussion of greenhouse flowers, that will no longer be able to reproduce. Well, in fact, you could say that these kind of exist today in the form of terminator seeds, right? The seeds that bio companies put out, which cannot produce a second generation. So you have to buy the seeds again every time you want to plant them. They won't sprout descendants. But beyond that, when we look at the rapid developments in the technologies of human reproduction, right, both in the techniques of birth control, artificial insemination, that have developed in very recent time, really, and we're seeing already on the horizon the likely creation of artificial wombs. What I think we're seeing there is a divergence between human sexuality and human reproduction, in which one doesn't entail the other. You can have sexuality without having any reproduction, and you will soon be able to have reproduction without any sexuality. And so we can envisage a future in which humans are no longer conceived or born without technical mediation, which again might be just another stage in this increasing entanglement of technology and humans. And if that's the case, of course, it might simply be that over time, innate human capacities for reproduction will wither away. So we might be like those greenhouse flowers. We can no longer reproduce without the assistance of some other mediation, technical mediation, because we no longer need those capacities. We no longer make use of these capacities.
And this entanglement that you were talking about, again, of technology and humans, is also discussed in a way in Tacker's and Galloway's book, where they say that escaping the surveillance being non-existent is the way to resist, meaning to really disentangle this connection between human and technology in a, I guess, more Unabomber way. So the way to become an exploit, of which we were talking before, is to fall off the radar screen. But I guess that you might disagree here, or you will disagree here, saying that this is not possible at all anymore. Be it through direct technological surveillance or through the permeation of the technological in the human. And in the vein, this seems to be in the vein of Virilio, who said that the will to see all, to know all at every instant, everywhere, the will to universalized illumination is a scientific version of the eye of God, which would forever rule out the surprise, the accident, the eruption of the unforeseen. The end of quote, which also seems to be a bit apocalyptic in a way, although we have a lot of technology now that are seeing almost all, not all, but some of the particular things that we as humans are doing, but at the same time that does not rule out the surprise. I mean, the knowledge of things does not rule out a surprise as such. So what do you think about this, the ways of resisting by going out of the system in a way?
Well, as you know, my main interest in surveillance has been from the military perspective, and in fact that would lead me not to say that it is possible to escape surveillance. There's in fact a whole body of countermeasures that have been developed to escape from military perceptions. This is what we often think of as techniques of camouflage, or in more contemporary terms, stealth. That there is a kind of becoming imperceptible that is associated to activities of hiding that develop alongside the development of military perception. Indeed, in order to conceal yourself, you generally have to use the same kind of bodies of knowledge as military perception, but you simply try to exploit their biases, their lacuna. You look for the weaknesses within those systems, within those procedures, in order to escape their reach. But that said, I think it's important to understand that there's a kind of dialectic here, because efforts at concealment and disguise end up being then the spur to new perceptual advances, right? So if something works, if a form of camouflage works and it's successful, then the next generation of perceptual technologies will seek to counter that. So it's very likely that any advantages in this realm are very transitory. And also we could, if we wanted to look at it on a kind of longer term perspective, it seems like the kind of technical countermeasures that have become prevalent in the military context. So, for example, stealth technologies that shape aircraft so that they have a very low radar cross-section, or development of particular materials that deflect radar or are not perceptible by infrared, and so on. These countermeasures tend to become increasingly onerous. Right? So if you think about the most advanced stealth bomber today, the American B-2, a single bomber costs about $1 billion, and there's only about 20 or so that have ever been constructed. So it may be that it becomes increasingly expensive to escape from perception, which on the other hand doesn't have the same kind of costs attached. You can just distribute sensors at a much reduced cost. But nevertheless, I think there are other ways to escape surveillance than the purely technical countermeasure. There are general strategies of what we might call concealment, dispersion, and expendability. And I would contend that, in fact, these are the strategies that are now coming increasingly to fore, that military perception has reached a level by which technical countermeasures are simply too costly to be available widely, and that there are other tactics or other strategies that are more appealing. For instance, you might change the terrain of battle. So this is certainly not new, but we know that if you conceal yourself in mountainous terrain, in forests, in jungle, or if you go underground, you will make it much harder for military technologies of perception to detect you. Perhaps the increasing environment in which asymmetric forces will conceal themselves in the future is the city. Right? We're living in a rapidly urbanizing world, and in the city as well, military technologies are simply not as effective than in an open space. But there's also the tactic of the swarm that we've already talked about a lot, and that might mean multiplying cheap expendable units. Right? So if you create swarms of, some analysts talk about billions of insect-like swarms, but let alone millions. You can imagine that even it's very likely that sensors can't pick all of them up, but indeed you can't even destroy all of them. So there's a move perhaps towards, rather than building large platforms, towards building much smaller, more expendable. And indeed, of course, the suicide bomber is a low-tech expression of the strategy of expendability. If you're willing to die, then you're much harder to stop. And then I think there's a final strategy, which is that of general concealment, where concealment is radicalized. It's not simply concealment from the, using military technologies, but it's concealment within the enemy's society. It's embedding oneself into the society, concealing one's presence entirely until the final moment of assault upon it.
And I guess that brings us to this, to Negarestani in his speculative fiction, his novel Cyclonopedia, where he writes of urban warfare, where forces, and I quote, advance in non-linear fashion, swarming into the area of operation from all directions, end of quote. And he also writes, which I guess it's quite important here, that these urban warriors should see everything from the perspective of an obstacle, which is in a way totally opposite of the non-existence. So to see everything from the perspective of an obstacle means can be connected to the things you were mentioning at the end of your answer. Negarestani, in a speculative way, is talking about parkour, again, of these obstacles where every soldier should be a tracer, a swerving projectile which has a deep sympathy with its physical obstacle. So the perspective on instrumental understanding of weapons, if we go to weapons again, is here turned. So human intentions do not seem to correspond with reality, and the humans become more or less the instruments of war, of architecture, of design. We were talking about this already before, but I guess what is your take on this urban warfare, and how is this going to... I mean, because, for example, the Clausewitzian fog of war is really present in the urban environments where war is going on, where battles are, because it's really hard to distinguish who the enemy is, who can assault you in a way, etc. So what are the last, I guess, the contemporary ways of warfare in the urban environment?
Well, I think this injunction to espouse the contour of one's environment, to disperse in the surroundings, speaks back to the last countermeasure to militarized perception. I was discussing this general concealment. Because on the one level, of course, you can think about the urban guerrilla, where troops are fighting in an urban environment, whether it's in a city in Syria today, or in Stalingrad or Leningrad in the Second World War. But we can also, I think about the forms of very sudden, unexpected violence of the suicide bomb, for instance. And here, Negarestani, I think, is very interesting because he develops this concept of hypercamouflage, where what he means by hypercamouflage is this complete dissolution of the enemy into the society that it wants to target. And that could be a society that's not otherwise at war, a pacified civil society. And I think this idea of hypercamouflage is interesting because when you think about traditional camouflage, so in the military context, there's a kind of paradox because camouflage is designed to conceal you, of course, but it is also constrained by certain requirements of the laws of war. So in order to be in conformity with the laws of war, soldiers have to wear uniforms. They have to wear clothes and have identifiers that make them clearly visible and identifiable as soldiers from a reasonable distance. Right? You cannot be conform to laws of war. You can't dress up as your enemy, which would be great camouflage, or you can't dress up as a civilian, which would also be a very effective form of camouflage. So the military has this paradox where they have to create uniforms that are invisible to some extent, but they have to be sufficiently visible that you can recognize them as soldiers. That, of course, is not a problem for hypercamouflage, which deliberately avoids all these kinds of conventions. And I think this participates in its own way in what we could call the disappearance of the battlefield. That's to say that, and that's, I think, is combined with the processes of global targeting, such as the drone, which can also strike in principle anywhere. It's the idea that the battlefield used to be a kind of constrained, bounded space. It used to be an area where, forces would meet and fight. Increasingly, the battlefield in this manner doesn't exist anymore. What we have are very confined spaces of very sudden violence. Frégrot calls these states of violence. Very narrow moments where eruptions of violence take place. It could be the kill box that the United States use to define the area in which it will conduct a drone strike, or it could be the suicide bomber detonating in busy public transport. And the important thing about the battlefield here is that it's important to understand it's not just a physical space, it's also a normative space. It's a space in which there are certain rules that dictate what can and can't be done in combat. And some of these rules are notably the rules about uniforms, but also about what kinds of violence can be deployed under what conditions, and so on. And crucially, it defines that as a bounded space. Killing is something that's permitted in the context of war within a particular space. Once that space disappears, we no longer have the ability to regulate this violence. We no longer have the kind of symmetric recognition of the adversaries that recognize each other as legitimate opponents. We instead have this kind of logistical deployments of sporadic violence. which leads me to suggest that what we're seeing is something akin to a kind of a molecularization of war. Instead of war being this kind of aggregate phenomena that we could clearly observe, it's dissipating within the social fabric.
In this context, I mean, in this kind of warfare, it becomes quite hard to look at something, to distinguish something from something else. And in this last question, we will be talking a bit, I mean, about your book, your forthcoming book, which will be published next year, The Martial Gaze, The Logistics of Military Perception in the Age of Global Targeting. So, how did this gaze change? I mean, we are already talking a bit about the warfare itself, the environments, etc. But how did this gaze change, and how to interpret Virilio's quote that says, "For man at war, the function of the weapon is the function of the eye"? What are the conditions on which the convergence flourished, and how it fits into the notion of modernity, maybe following Enlightenment and its quest for man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, as Kant said. Jordan Crandall writes, for example, and I quote, "Looking has come to mean calculating rather than visualizing in the traditional sense, and where seeing is infused with the logics of tactics and maneuver." End of quote. So if one can see because of light, and light seems to play less and less important role in contemporary warfare, what the eye as such actually stands for, and when can we start to call it otherwise, non-biomorphic, etc.?
Well, it's certainly true that the human eye is increasingly at a remove in war. There are many non-visual modes of perception that have been developed, from infrared, radar, sound, and so on, such that the eye is often being presented with mediations. So there are representations that are visual representations that are produced for operators, for human operators, so that they can interpret what radar or what infrared perceives. While at the same time, of course, there are increasingly machines that see without human intermediary, right? Where what they actually, and I say see, of course, in inverted commas, whatever they perceive doesn't go through the visual. It's electrical currents that are algorithmically processed. And of course, there's perhaps an irony with the development of the laser, which I think is a kind of key technology, because laser is both a perceptual technology, but it's potentially also a weapon. There's a lot of efforts being put into developing high-powered lasers that haven't quite come to fruition, but I think may well do in the coming decades. But the irony, of course, is that there is an area in which a laser is an effective weapon today, and that's as a blinding weapon. One of the eye happens to be a very sensitive organ to the laser. If you fire a moderately powered laser at someone's eye, you will do them great damage. So there's the kind of irony here in that the laser, which is a kind of combination of research and developments of perception that have been conducted through the human eye, end up producing a weapon that destroys the eye. And that perhaps gets me to the early part of your question, which is, how this fits into perhaps a wider history of modernity. And I think my contention would be that there's a certain dispossession of the human eye that has evolved throughout and alongside modernity. So, in fact, I think we have to go all the way back to, one of the founding moments of the modern era, which is certainly culturally speaking, which is the invention or discovery of linear perspective in Western art. Because linear perspective is not merely, a very striking form of visual representation, but actually it's entangled with techniques of visual measurement, of representation, of spatial representation, that in fact at the nub of it we find a set of intertwined processes of rationalization of vision and mathematization of space. it tries to abstract the processes of vision and understand how vision and spatial orientation correlate with one another. And I think it's a key moment, because when we understand it in this way, I think we can see that there's a very particular type of subject that emerges from that. Because what we have effectively is, one of the classical accounts of linear perspective, when you read the cultural histories of linear perspective, is that it's a great humanist moment. It's a great humanist moment because a perspectival image is one that is designed for a human viewer. Right? In order to see the perspectival image, in order to see the depth perception, you have to be standing in a particular point to look at the image, and it's understood in this way as a shift between a pre-modern form of visual representation of art that's drew images on a kind of divine landscape. So that's to say that they represented objects in relation to their importance. So bigger objects are more important than smaller objects. There's no attempt to develop a representation that is akin to human vision. And however, perspective does that. It presents art as something that's for a human viewer, and therefore people make the connection by saying that this is an artistic representation of the Renaissance, of the great humanist moment that places the man at the center of the world, or center of the universe. And I think there's a lot to that, but I think that what we miss there is that there's a second or simultaneous movement happening at the same time. That it's not simply about an empowered sovereign subjects, the one that Kant was talking about, if you want, but it's also an objectified subject, if you want, because what linear perspective does is it abstracts perception and it formulates rational mathematical rules that govern this perception, and it creates the conditions by which you can start to automate and autonomize this perception. So the prerequisite to creating the kind of autonomous technologies of perception that we have today is this abstraction from human embodied vision. So at that particular moment, we have both a subject that's if you want, empowered, but also is for whom perception is increasingly becoming disembedded from their biological from the body. And so, in a way, what we see emerging, if there is a gaze that is emerging, it's a gaze that sees without a subject. It's a gaze that sees without a subject. It's a gaze that sees without a subject.
I'm sure all of us, and particularly our children, are familiar with earache. A particularly nasty form of earache is when otitis media develops, that's infection of the middle ear. And it's surprising how guidelines about how to manage this problem are very diverse across different countries.